Welcome to Block 5 of our Block of the Month 2022. This month's block uses 1/8 yard of a medium fabric and 1/8 yard of a dark fabric. You can find this pattern to print in the files section of our Facebook group called The Quilted Forest Friends, or you can push pause and take notes, or you can screenshot it and print it from home. I'll show it again at the end of the video and you can print it then, but right now it's time to cut. From the medium fabric, you need to cut 2 strips that are 1.5 inches by the width of the fabric. I cut it at 3 inches first, and then I back it down to 1.5 inches so I don't have to move the fabric as much. You also need to cut 2 strips that are 1.5 inches by the width of fabric from the dark fabric. I like to lay all my fabrics right next to each other, so I'm going to line my strips up, all 4 of them, the 2 mediums and the 2 darks, and cut all my pieces at once. From each of the fabrics, you need to cut 4 rectangles that are 1.5 by 5.5, and 8 rectangles that are 1.5 by 3.5. And by doing this, cut at 7 inches first, and then I can cut it down to 3.5 inches. I'll get all 8 of my rectangles. You could cut all of these pieces separately off of the strips, but it would take a lot longer. So that's why I like to put my strips all together and make just one cut to get all the pieces I need. And then I just need to cut 6 squares that are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches from 2 of the strips. I've also cut my pieces for my bright prints on a black background version and my red, white, and blue version. Now it's time to sew. Make sure that you're using 1/4 inch seam allowances. Piece the medium 1.5 inch squares onto opposite sides of the dark 1.5 inch square. You're going to make 2 of those units. And then you're also piecing the dark 1.5 inch squares onto opposite sides of the medium 1.5 inch squares. You're going to make 2 of that one also. I have my little ironing board set up right next to my machine so that I can press after each seam. Make sure you're pressing away from the center. So 2 of these units will be pressed towards the medium, 2 of these will be pressed towards the dark. Dark squares get added to the unit where the seam is pressed to the dark. Medium squares get added to the unit where the seam is pressed to the medium. Once you add the rest of the squares to these units, they should measure 3.5 inches long. Remember that all the seams are going to be pressed away from the center block. For the next step, you're going to add the rectangles onto opposite sides of the center unit. So you're going to piece the medium 1.5 inch by 3.5 inch rectangles onto opposite sides of the unit that has the dark in the center. You're going to piece the dark 1.5 inch by 3.5 inch rectangles onto opposite sides of the unit that has the medium in the center. It should make a square around that medium square. You're going to make 2 of each unit. Make sure you hit that like button if you're enjoying our Block of the Month series, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our future blocks. Once these are sewn together and pressed, these middle sections should measure 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. Next, we are going to piece the dark 1.5 inch by 3.5 inch rectangles onto the opposite sides of the unit that has the dark in the center. You're going to do 2 of these units. Make sure that you're sewing that onto the part where the seams are, not to this part that doesn't have any seams. We are also going to be piecing the medium 1.5 inch by 3.5 inch rectangles onto opposite sides of the unit that has the medium in the center. You're going to make 2 of these. And I know I said to press after each seam, but I'm going to go ahead and add the other side of this unit before I press so I can do both of the seams at once. Now it's time to piece the medium 1.5 inch by 5.5 inch rectangles onto opposite sides of the unit that has the medium in the center. You will make 2 of those units. And also you're sewing the dark 1.5 inch by 5.5 inch rectangles onto the opposite sides that have the dark in the center. You are also making 2 of those. Once these units are pressed, they should measure 5.5 inches by 5.5 inches. You can trim as necessary. These 4 5.5 inch squares get sewn together to make a row that measures 5.5 by 20.5. When piecing these blocks together, rotate one set of blocks to prevent having to match the seams. One last seam and our row is complete. Then all you have to do is press it and make sure that it measures 5.5 inches by 20.5 inches. I've also been working on my row that has the red, white, and blue version and the black background with bright colors version. Here is a bonus block idea for using 2.5 inch strips using the same pattern and technique. From one strip, cut 2 pieces that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches and 2 pieces that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches. From a different fabric, cut 1 square that is 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. I dug through my scrap pile and found a bunch of old strips from jelly rolls and other pieces that I cut and mixed and matched them to make the blocks. The technique for putting these bigger blocks together is the same that you used for the 5.5 inch blocks. When I work on scrappy quilts like this, I will try to just work on 2 blocks at a time. I feel like I see a little bit more progress that way, and it's easier to keep track of which pieces go with which block. These blocks will finish 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches, and once they're sewn into a quilt, they will be 10 inches by 10 inches. This makes it easy to figure out how many blocks you need to make a quilt. So if you wanted to make a quilt that measured 60 inches by 80 inches, you would need to have it set 6 blocks across by 8 blocks down. So that's a total of 48 blocks, and it would measure 60 by 80 when you're done. If you need a smaller quilt, you could go 4 blocks across, 5 blocks down for a total of 20 blocks, and it would measure 40 by 50. I think this is an ideal block for a scrappy quilt, a great way to use up extra pieces from things, and you wouldn't actually have to have the center block match the outer ring. You could have a different fabric for every ring that you make on this block. Once I had the pieces cut for these blocks, I figured it took about 10 minutes, between 8 and 10 minutes to make 2 blocks from start to finish. So with luck, you could finish about 12 blocks in an hour. If you spent an hour every night for a week making blocks, you could have up to a king-size quilt at the end. You could pick a totally scrappy quilt and just use up whatever you happen to find in your scrap bucket, or you could pick from a limited palette, say only use green strips and a background, or only use black fabrics with a pop of color. You could make this any kind of quilt that you wanted. I had only planned to make a few blocks just to show you how they would turn out for this video, but once I started sewing them, they were kind of fun to make, and I just kept going and having a good time getting rid of some scraps. I will confess that it didn't use as many scraps as I was hoping, but then I only made about 25-30 blocks. So I think I'm going to keep going and make this a big quilt, probably a king size quilt, just to see how many scraps I can use up. Here is a sample of a block that has a different fabric for each step of the process. And here's a sample of the blocks that I made in just one afternoon using scraps I had in my 2.5-inch scrap bin. I hope you enjoyed that bonus project. We hope you'll hit that like button, make a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!